Our next step is to come up with ways to measure this economic surplus that derives from a market, from a change to a market, things like that. Our basis for this is going to be the transaction, is going to be the trade taking place between a buyer and a seller. We make this assumption that these trades are voluntary. That is, that people are going to make a trade only if it makes them better off, both the buyer and the seller. We would assume that if the seller places a greater value on, say, a used car, we're going to use a used car here as our good that we examine over the next few slides. If the seller is not willing to let that used car go for any less than the maximum price the buyer is willing to pay for it, then they can't trade. So that means that if we see a trade take place, it must be that the amount that the buyer is willing to pay, we call that their willingness to pay, is greater than the lowest amount that the seller would take, which the book calls their willingness to sell. I don't really like that phrase, but we're going to use it just because it's what the book uses. Now, the point of thinking about these ideas is to realize that the difference between those two is the amount of the economic surplus that can occur in this market. Let's run through it with some numbers here. So let's say you're willing to pay $7,000 for a particular used car, and our seller is willing to sell it for any price $5,000 or higher. Then what we say is that the potential economic surplus that could take place, that could result from this transaction, is the difference between these two, which is $2,000. Now let's suppose you end up settling on a price of $5,750. So now the difference between your willingness to pay and the price you actually pay is your, as the buyer, economic surplus from this transaction. For the seller, their economic surplus is the difference between the lowest price they would have accepted and the price they actually get. In this case, it's $750, so we say that the seller's surplus in this situation is $750. Now, naturally, depending on what sort of willingness to pay and willingness to sell different people have, they're going to obtain more or less surplus. We generally think of a market as a bunch of buyers and sellers coming together to make trades. That's sort of the definition we've had all along in economics here. But now we could add in a different way of phrasing that. It's a collection of buyers and sellers who are coming together making trades in order to generate surplus. Depending on their willingness to pay or willingness to sell, they might get lots of surplus if they have a very high willingness to pay, a little surplus if they have less, or zero if they are willing to pay no more than whatever the price is that they would need to pay. If they are willing to pay exactly the market price and they do engage in that transaction, then we would say they'd get zero surplus. And if they don't engage in a trade, we also say they get zero economic surplus.